We're very privileged to have here amongst us Tom Linton, who is a stalwart of all things supply chain and procurement. He has had several senior leadership roles, and today is actually a senior advisor to McKinsey Company on supply chain procurement and other related strategies. So I want to introduce you, Tom Linton, who is here with us.
It's great.
Thank you, Tom.
Great to have the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for having taking the time to be with us.
Sure.
So at the moment, we have been discussing the launch of our much-awaited CaaS wallet, which is capital as a service embodied into a wallet. And we've had the chance to discuss this with Tom and take his impressions. So, Tom, here's a question for you.
Sure.
Amongst the fintech developments that you have seen thus far, inventory is just being addressed as a potential problem that could drive economies, that could drive the performance of companies, and either develop losers or winners. Mm-hmm. From your close proximity analysis and evaluation of where inventory, supply chain, and procurement stands today with geopolitical risks as well as the challenges of supply chain, what is your forecast for the world in 2022, 23, 24?
Yeah. Well, when I look at supply chain, I usually define it in 3 words: material in motion, which really is cash in motion. And every time you have a disruption, every time you have a problem, whether it be COVID or wars or conflicts or even economic, social, what happens is inventory gets distorted. And supply chains are about time. So when you distort time, you actually cause inventories to build up in odd ways. Sometimes it builds up on the front end of the supply chain, sometimes the middle, sometimes the end. And when these things happen, material's not moving, therefore cash is not moving. And you have issues around how long you can hold it before it becomes economically difficult for you. So the world is not getting less disrupted. It seems to be getting more. And I'm not talking just what I talked about, but things like hurricanes, things like problems associated with logistics. And so this idea of having access to capital that's more flexible and readily available for instances where you have this variability or this wobbling, I think is going to be very interesting for people to have, because without it, you're basically going to have everything you don't need, which is a lot of cash piling up while you're waiting for something you're missing. So it's called a clear to build problem when you have everything else, but you're missing one thing. And products are more complex. I mean, look at everything that we buy today. A lot more complicated, a lot more moving parts, the bill of materials are more intense. And I don't see that trend from a forecast standpoint changing. It's only going to get more complex.
Well, I heard the words, "it's about time" from you.
Yeah. And
that caught my attention. It's not only about time for companies to think about fintech in supply chain in a very different and innovative way, but I think it's also about time to recognize the challenges that magnified inventory positions, or, for example, supplier payments issues, etc., are being challenged at the corporate level. Yet there is no real solution, and so when you look at something like a CaaS wallet, which has the embodiment of financial technologies that also give you capital, is this a tool you think that could potentially bring benefits to a CFO or treasurer, finance departments, and procurement together? Any impressions?
Yeah, well, companies run on plans, and yes, they run on forecasts. And if you're public, they run on guidance. So whenever you have these wobbles that I talk about, this variability in primarily the front end of your supply chain, that can ripple into disrupting your plans, disrupting your forecast, disrupting your guidance. So what's super valuable about this is it allows you to stay in your lane as you forecast and as you plan. So it gives you, the most important thing a business can do is plan reliably. So if you can plan reliably, because your that variability gets absorbed by the access to easy capital in order to finance that variability, you're going to have a much more predictable business, much more stable business. Even as disruption and variability is introduced into it, you can actually kind of almost like slow it down and smooth it out.
So it's almost akin to putting guardrails around how companies, corporates, and essentially procurement and inventory management functions behave. We've seen fintechs that do receivables financing, factoring, and others, but there has been some amount of adoption hesitation to fintechs in the world of supply chain finance, trade finance, and that's the intersection of where the procurement teams and the finance people, the finance folk, come together. Do you see more collaboration in this field right now? There has been some adoption issues, and I think the situation today perhaps lends itself to much more easier adoption.
Well, supplier financing tends to be used in situations where suppliers may have something going on in their either their customer base or their supplier base where they're in. I don't want to say trouble; that's too strong of a word, but sometimes it's a period impact. What I'm talking about is something a little bit more sustainable, almost the same way you use your own personal credit card, right?
Yes.
It just allows for the ease of use. It's the ease of use issue, the variability, the planning stability, things that kind of smooth out a supply chain. It's just like if you smooth something out, it's going to be less variable, more consistent, more predictable, and more reliable. Yeah. So this is where I think people will see the value of it, especially if it's done at a reasonable cost, versus going through the kind of the lumpy process of borrowing money. That's a lumpy one, right? That's almost periodic, large, bumpy kind of process, slow. Something that's light and fast. Mm-hmm. Supply chains are all about speed. So how do you how do you make the friction of a supply chain go away, and access to that kind of money in the right periods of time allow for things to move smoothly? They don't get hung up, right? You want a frictionless supply chain, you want a fast supply chain, and yet by definition, supply chains are always being hit with disruptions. Mm-hmm. So you're basically almost creating like the ways of supply chain, if you will, where you can actually kind of move more smoothly through the entire economic and the financial side of the supply chain, not just the physical side of supply chain. Yeah. That I think is what will bring value.
Oh, that's very interesting. So if you had a tool like this as a CPO, as a chief procurement officer, where inventory was held in trust, it's not for somebody else. People would not speculate on it, and it's held in trust. Do you think that would have been a huge tool or an asset to you? Or would you look at it in the future?
And I think most companies have there's partnerships between the finance organization and the operations organizations, or the purchasing and the supply chain. So by working together on this, I mean, inventory. Let's face it, inventory is everything you don't need, right? At the time. So it can, and if you hold it too long, it becomes excess and obsolete, mm-hmm. and then you have to sell it. So, you don't want that weighing down your supply chain. You want to be able to, park that, if you will.
Yes.
You want to park your inventory outside your business while you're running your supply chain. So that to me would be the value from a supply chain procurement standpoint. It doesn't become something that weighs down your supply chain. There's only, right now, for example, people, you've got a lot of material coming in, but you're waiting for semiconductors, for example, right? Well, there's almost so much yelling you can do at your semiconductor suppliers to get those parts. It's not going to work. So you have to find other mechanisms to prevent that inventory from becoming too expensive for you to keep. And a lot of times, companies right now, have a lot of stuff sitting around while they're waiting for, say, a semiconductor. But tomorrow it could be, some precious metal. It could be some other thing in your supply chain. You never know what's going to slow it down. Supply chains are complex. There's always going to be an issue somewhere. I call it crisis du jour in supply chain management. You just have to wake up every day knowing there's going to be an issue. So the question is, how do you more efficiently run your supply chain? And I think having tools and access to easy capital, so you can park, say, raw material inventory, while you're waiting for something else, or help smooth out the flow and the variability. I think that's where it's going to become helpful. The same way in my personal life, where I don't always want to carry a lot of cash in my pocket. I use a credit card.
Yes.
Same, but applied to business.
Indeed. There was a time, and again, I remember this from my leadership days, that supply chain executives, in monthly meetings and executive leadership team meetings weren't necessarily the first ones to be called to talk about the situation of business. It would be generally the CEOs, the CFOs, the heads of sales departments talking about forecasts and so on. Over the last 24 to 36 months, there has been a tectonic shift in the way that leadership team meetings are conducted, and supply chain, perhaps, and procurement people are the first ones to opine about whether business is all right or the challenges. Do you see that you've seen many companies now addressing this? So from your lens, what do you see?
It's rather funny, right? In the first quarter, I think 60-70% of the most commonly used words in analysts and calls and investor discussions were supply chain problem. So, and it's one of these things that's almost become a one-word verb, supply chain problem. So, and whenever there's a problem in supply chain, there's an opportunity to address how that supply chain problem, let's face it, is synonymous with inventory problem. Delivery generally means there's a clot, or there's the traffic's backing up, so something's slowing it down. And therefore you have money which isn't moving, because material and cash in motion, cash in motion are synonymous. So that means your cash is slowing down. And when cash slows down, balance sheets rise. So these kinds of issues, I think, are just enormously important to understand, and how CFOs with chief procurement officers and chief supply chain officers can really address a new way of thinking around how they manage that piece of the pie, so that, as the surprises hit them, which will be constant, they have a new mechanism, a new tool that actually allows them to kind of provide relief to their planning systems or their forecasts. And so investors love predictability. They love predictability. So when you become when you can't predict, then that becomes a problem.
You're amongst, I would say, the rare of the leadership team execs in one function having full appreciation of the other. And generally, people would understand, but procurement folks, understanding the limitations, understanding the situations of the CFO, the treasury, as a corporate as a whole. That also needs to be some amount of development on that end. You've played this role very effectively for almost a $30 billion company here. Any words of advice that you would like to give to the procurement folks of today, and how they should work with the finance folks, or the finance folks working with the procurement funds?
Right or wrong, procurement people get heavily measured on cost reduction. But as we've learned over the last couple of years, sometimes in inflationary times, you have to switch your attention to the balance sheet from the income statement. And so many procurement people get hung up on, how come they're not reducing costs? Why isn't that happening? These kinds of issues, which have to be addressed almost at the design level. You've got to redesign your products if you want to take cost out now, because inflation is rising. So I would suggest sitting down with the CFO, sitting down with the treasurer, sitting down with folks and trying to have conversations around how can we also expand our horizons to include the balance sheet? What can we do to help there? Because that's where the value of a company is going to be enhanced. There isn't a company on the planet where investors aren't looking at the balance sheet and saying, what is this company doing there? It's not just the treasurer's responsibility. It's not just the CFO's responsibility. You have to address it more creatively and look for solutions that give you, ways of actually managing your balance sheet differently. And the cost now, because of where the offering is, the LIBOR hit is so minor that actually you have to actually super minor impact to the income statement in order to significantly enhance the balance sheet. This kind of thinking, I think, is where it's important.
And that's exactly where the CaaS wallet plays. We are at the intersection, I call it the final frontier of where trade, inventory, supply chain, and finance meet. Inventory has been a hard issue for people to solve and fund, and mostly on balance sheets, or a hot potato that they would want somebody else to take care of, either the suppliers or a contract manufacturer, and people would find ways of trying to isolate that problem and make it somebody else's. But you can't really alienate this problem from OEMs.
Yeah, it's like in physics, matter cannot be created or destroyed. It's going to move somewhere. So if you whack-a-mole it in one place, the inventory is going to move to your supplier.
Yes.
Right. And if he hits it, it's going to go to his supplier. It doesn't disappear. It just moves. So somebody along that path is going to get stuck with the additional impact if they don't have a tool to moderate that impact. So I don't care where you are in the supply chain, everybody's got a customer. And so how do you actually, when you're stuck with a situation, maybe your customer is asking you to hold it,
yes,
or maybe you're asking your suppliers to hold it, somebody has that issue. And, and I could see having conversations with suppliers saying, look, I need you to hold the inventory, but I have a solution for you.
Yes.
I have a way to help mitigate that impact to you. I think there's all kinds of conversations that can be had with easier access to capital in the supply chain process.
Almost like a shock absorber of systems.
Yeah,
you think about how do you put a shock absorber so that you still want to ride the rough ride, but not necessarily take the shock.
Just like in our personal life, let's put that on the credit card, right?
And deal with it. In the wallet, we're going to talk about 3 different cards. There is going to be the inventory card to hold inventories on our books. There's going to be a supplier pay card, which is going to pay suppliers faster so that we can mitigate their issues, and also a factoring card that would help receive payments from your customers faster. But the most important one that we're talking about here is the inventory card. Now, this card is not going to allow you to buy coffee at Starbucks. So it won't. But it would essentially be a really solid tool for the procurement staff to be able to hold inventory and order inventory at this point in time without taking possession financially of it. It would be physically in their possession. So as a tool, how strong do you think this tool could be in the wallets of procurement people?
Well, the remarkable thing about supply chains and operations in general is they tend to be very local in nature. So you're a factory manager in Omaha, right? And all of a sudden you've got an issue and your P&L for your factory is impacted. Well, this is where you can take a tool like this and actually help help your P&L. Because basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the shock out of the cost of carrying something and pushing it off your books, and do that for a period of time so that you can pull it back in again. I think it's that opportunistic kind of opportunistic situation that you face at every factory, whether you're in contract manufacturing, whether you're in product, you have your vertical integration, you have your own factories. But supply chains tend to be very local. It's not like somebody sitting in a CFO's office in an ivory tower, whipping out a card, right? It's the local guy who now has a new tool. So CFOs or CPOs or COOs should be thinking about how do they give these tools to their organization so that they can use them in their own creative ways, right? Like a P card, purchasing card kind of thing. Well, at least for inventory. I mean, P cards became huge as a flexible way of people buying things, right? This is just another way, only on the balance sheet, and a little different.
This is very interesting. So as we heard Tom say, the procurement people are going to have several cards in their wallet. This wallet is going to be a big fat wallet with potentially one of the biggest limits in town. And so you have the choice to buying your materials on your own balance sheet using your own CFO's card, or using this tool from the CaaS card to acquire the same inventories, but without really paying for it at this time, or acquiring it on your balance sheet. So I think this is a huge tool, and it will be very beneficial to the CFOs and the CPOs as a strategic element in their toolkit. Thank you very much again, Tom. Appreciate your efforts.